Salutations, everybody. It's your boy Alex Bucky 142, and today we're going to be doing a tier list of historical empires here. Now, it's just a random tier list that I found online. Had some pretty cool historical empires here. So, I'm going to go through each of them, sort of explain what I think about them, and rank them on a tier list. Now, for this one here, I'm going to rank S tier as being a world-shattering, an empire that had just an incredible legacy, an empire that completely changed the world. And D tier is an empire that was relatively short-lived, perhaps, or something that really didn't have a global sort of impact. So, I just repeat. S-tier empires are empires that completely changed the world, and then D-tier empires are empires that really didn't last long or didn't have much of an impact on the world. Cool. That being said, let's get started with the British Empire. This is 100% S-tier. I'm sorry, anyone who says that the British Empire is not S-tier is a complete fool, is a complete a buffoon. In all the wrong ways. There's a reason why English is the world trade language, and it's not because people just like English. It's because how the British conquered everything. And they cucked China. They cucked 1,000-year-old civilizations without even trying. They just sent their fleets and just flexed on everybody. There's just no... this doesn't even need an explanation. How the British Empire is an S-tier civilization, and its legacy is still felt today. There's a reason why English is the global trade language. There's a reason why nations are drawn the way they are, and it's not because they're drawn the way they are. It's because the British drew those maps for them. So, no further explanation here. Britain was the second largest empire of all. No, first largest empire of all time. They are 100% S tier. Second one is the Mongol Empire. This gets S tier as well. Now, the Mongol Empire's legacy isn't so much the Mongol Empire itself, it's all the ripple effects. First, they had the first largest contiguous empire of all time. That has to count for something. And they were able to hold that empire together for some time despite being a nomads who really didn't care to be held together like that. The Mongol Empire's legacy is mostly in its after effects. Its successor Khanates lasted for hundreds of years. In fact, the last one, the Crimean Khanate, really didn't end until rather recently. And up until the communist takeover, there were still descendants of Genghis Khan ruling in Mongolia. Granted, they were Qing vassals, but they were ruling in Mongolia as descendants of Genghis Khan. And every single nomadic warlord after Genghis was either related to him or claimed to be related to him. In the case of Tamerlane, who married a Genghis woman just so that he could sort of claim to be part of this royal lineage. Yeah, the Mongols were some of the greatest conquerors of all time. And while they don't have the political or cultural legacy as the British, their conquests have to count for something. They are 100% S tier. Let's move on to the Russian Empire. I'll put the Russian Empire on B tier. Yeah, they had a really massive empire, but their legacy... Okay, they have a big legacy in that Russia still likes to flex its muscles. The current Ukraine versus Russia war is because of this historical enmity between the two powers, and because the Russian Empire historically conquered that land. But Russia's legacy is kind of in its own sphere. It didn't have a global impact as some of the other empires, and to be honest, the Russian Empire got flexed on so many times by other empires. They got completely flexed on by Napoleon several times. They got flexed on by the Japanese. They got flexed on by everybody, really. Yeah, they had a lot of historical victories, but they also had a lot of historical defeats. They weren't really a super great power as some of the other nations were. They didn't really colonize. Aside from Siberia, they didn't really try and spread out. They kind of kept their thing. And whenever they tried to get themselves involved in world affairs, it really didn't end well. They kept getting smacked back. Yeah, they had a massive empire. They're a really big empire, but I mean, their legacy isn't as apparent, and their downfall can't be understated. Very aggressive downfall there. So they get B tier. I would promote them up, but they had severe structural inefficiencies such as serfdom that really held them back, and the lack of literacy really meant that they couldn't really compete in cultural ways. Cool. Let's move on to the Spanish Empire. This will get B tier. Okay, Spanish is one of the world's most spoken languages for a reason. It's because the Spanish conquered so much. But the Spanish Empire really was the first European empire to sort of end. By that I mean after the Napoleonic Wars, Spain's empire was gone. Yeah, Spain was a minor power, but it really didn't have the power that it once had. It was once a great power. A superpower. It was able to flex its muscles wherever it wanted. Whereas after the Napoleonic Wars, even before the Napoleonic Wars, it was a sick man. It really wasn't a global hegemon anymore. Kind of depending on scraps. And in the end, the sad, pathetic remnants of the empire were taken away by the Americans, and Spain sort of withered away. Now, they get B tier because Spanish is one of the world's most important languages. The silver that they mined in Bolivia really underpinned the global system of trade for a long time. But the Spanish Empire gets B tier just because it ended first, and the Spanish Empire really, in its last days, was really not strong. It was sick. It was really weak. The Qing dynasty, one of my favorites. This will get C tier. And let me explain why here. The Qing were a very powerful empire. In fact, they had the fourth largest empire ever to exist. The problem, but the reason I put them in C tier isn't because they weren't a powerful empire. They weren't a global hegemon. They were a regional power. They thought themselves as a global hegemon. But when they started getting flexed on by Europe, they got flexed on hard. There's a reason why they call it the century of humiliations, because the only country that they managed to humiliate was Italy. Of course, Italy always gets humiliated. But the Qing dynasty were strong for about 100 years, and then they spent 200 years just kind of collapsing away, kind of withering away until they kind of petered out into nothingness. So I'm going to put them in C tier. They were powerful until they weren't. They weren't really a global superpower. They were regional until even Japan has supplanted them as a powerful nation there. So they get C tier. They're going to stay there. I could be convinced to move them to B tier, but they weren't really a global power. They were very regional, and they really didn't affect much outside of their realm. France is next. They get A tier. France's legacy is mixed. They gained an empire first, and then they lost it. Then they gained an empire in Africa that they still kind of rule over economically and culturally. But France's legacy is kind of mixed. Its empire ended around the same time as the British, but they weren't really as globally influential. Now, French was once the lingua franca, the French language, literally. But it no longer is. French really isn't the superpower language that it once was. It's not the language of global business. It's not the language of global trade anymore. It's just not. The French Empire has always been almost S tier, but not quite. They've always been a tier below Britain. They've been powerful, but not quite. There's a reason why they got humiliated in Vietnam and other places. It's because they're just not the same power as Britain or some of the other empires are. They're certainly global spanning. They're certainly very influential. Just not the superpower that some of the other nations are. Alright, this next one has the Abbasid and the Umayyads. I'm going to put these both together in S tier. Okay, so the rise of Islam is one of the most influential moments in all of history. No ifs, whens, or buts. 100% influential here. And the fact that they were able to conquer so much in such a short period of time cannot be understated. Wherever they went, they were getting victories. Their generals were going out with fervor. In a generation, they went from a bunch of random disparate tribes into as Peter Frankopan puts it, people who inherited the earth. Their sciences, their arts were top tier. And while the world was going through a dark age, they were going through a renaissance, the likes of which the world has not seen before. They were the global superpowers. Their empire stretched from Iberia to China. Wherever they went, people bent the knee to them. Granted, the empires did become too large to really manage after a while. Too disparate. But there's a reason why they conquered more land than the Romans did. Absolutely powerful empires, stunning empires, with massive global power at the time, as well as legacy in the form of Islam today and that corner of the world. The reason why Islam spread so far, and it was at the point of the sword, and it was by these two caliphates. So they get S tier. Next up here is the Hanu. I don't know why this is on the list, but that's D tier. Hanu fought with China for a long time, but what legacy did they have? I can't think of much. Yeah, they did push the Huns west. Maybe the Huns are the Hanu or the Shanu, whatever you call them, but isn't much of legacy. They fought China. They managed to push Turkic tribes west, which had caused the Great Migrations, but Hanu are a D tier empire. They didn't really do much. They were kind of their own thing. They were constantly subjugated by China or fought back. They get their own. It's a really weird inclusion here to have that there. Empire of Brazil is also going to get D tier. I'm not going to say that they weren't a great empire. They were a strong empire, certainly a regional one. But Brazil is constantly punched up below its weight. It's not because of anything really there. It's because they're kind of in their own worst enemy, and it's partially geographic. But the Empire of Brazil really didn't have a global impact. They were regional hegemons, kind of like the Great Qing, but they were kind of in the forgotten corner of the world. South America really hasn't been a global player. You could probably remove the South American continent, and not much would change. Sorry about all you South American subscribers. I'm sorry. But the Empire of Brazil really wasn't a global power. It didn't influence global affairs. They weren't a great power. They've never been considered a great power. A power, to be sure, it's just not a great one. Japan will get B tier. The most impressive part of Japan is how quickly they were able to spread. In just a generation, they went from being a feudal state to being a first world, or to being a global superpower within a generation. That type of foresight is incredible. And at the time, I'm going to put them on A tier. During World War II, they were able to give America a run for its money. And yeah, America was going to crush Japan once America got fully engaged. But Japan was able to bring a lot of powers to their knees for a long time. Japan's influence spread. Their influence is still here. All you weebs understand that. Yeah, Japan, granted, they were defeated in the end, but it took a global coalition to really take them down. They were a first-rate superpower, able to spread their influence far beyond and punch far beyond their weight. Japan gets A tier. They're not quite on the list as Britain or Mongols, but they're A tier. Iberian Union, same as Spanish, B tier for the same reasons. The Achaemenid Empire will get A tier. Okay. The Achaemenids are A tier because of what it represented. It was a short-lived empire. It was conquered by Alexander the Great. But so many rulers afterwards have tried to emulate the Achaemenids. They were the first real global superpower, with an empire stretching from Macedonia all the way to India. They were the first global superpower, the biggest empire the world had seen up to that time. The empire that they built was the template for all empires, in a way. With its satraps, with its multilingualism, with its multiculturalism, the Achaemenids really were the template for the empire, for what an empire meant to be. And Alexander the Great went east because of the Achaemenids. When the Sassanids came, they tried to emulate the Achaemenid Empire. Persian states, up to this day, have claimed the Achaemenid banner as their forebearers. Yeah, the Achaemenids' legacy isn't as, say, potent as, say, Britons or Rome Mongols. The Achaemenid Empire has been a template for a long time. And that's why they're A tier. Yeah, they fell pretty harshly, but I would even consider, say, the Parthians or Sassanids to be spiritual descendants. So their legacy lived on in that sense. The Ottomans get A tier as well. I'm putting the Ottomans in A tier because of they were the European superpower for a long time. They had to be pushed back by a coalition of a ton of nations. But they're A tier, I'm gonna put them in B tier. They were powerful for a long time, but when they got weak, they got weak. They were the sick man of Europe at the end. And their political legacy isn't as apparent. Yeah, Turkey sort of claims them, but not really. The Ottomans, at their prime, were able to bring European states to heel. But at the end, it was kind of sick, kind of pathetic, and it died a miserable death at the hands of all the European powers that wanted to chop up all of its lands for their own ends. They were, I'd argue, the most powerful empire in the world at the time. This is why they're not ranked lower. But by the time the center of the world's gravity changed from around Constantinople to Western Europe because of colonialism, well, the Ottomans were left out. Were left out in the cold. They never colonized. They were boxed in by geography, so they could never really spread their power. And while all the European powers were getting rich off the New World, they were kind of still stuck there, stuck in the past, stuck trying to ape a legacy that died. So the Ottomans get B tier. A very influential empire, just not globally influential in that sense. Rome is S tier. Rome is S tier because its legacy is the most. I'm going to put this in the best part of S tier. Rome is the most influential empire of all time. Every single European power and even non-European powers have tried to ape its legacy or claim its legacy for their own. England claimed its democracy. Russia, its spiritual legacy. France, its language. Spain, its language. Italy, its direct legacy. There's a reason why Caesar, the title Caesar, Czar, Kaiser, Kaiserin has remained the title for rulers up until very recently. It's not because they liked the sound of the name. It's because Rome is the template for what a state should be. Rome's legacy is its political and cultural legacy. So much of the world speaks Romance languages because of Rome. A democracy, empire, politics, all of it comes from Rome, basically. Now, the American founders were reading Roman political theory to try and craft their sort of constitution. Rome's legacy is it's everywhere. The rest here. Now this one here, I don't know what this is. I'm gonna say it's I don't know who that guy is. What the heck? I'm gonna say it's the Greeks. They get A tier then. The Greek legacy is, of course, very profound. Actually, I'll put them a B. The Greeks sort of influenced Rome in that sense. I'll put them there, but their direct political legacy isn't as profound as some of the others. But culturally, 100% A tier. They're sort of up there with some of the other nations as some of the best in the entire world. Yeah, they got conquered and flexed on by everybody, but they conquered Rome culturally, so they're A tier. Egypt, D tier. Okay. I did that immediately, not because I hate Egypt, because Egypt hasn't been relevant in a long time. They were the Bronze Age power for a long time, but once they withered away, they withered hard. In fact, here's a fun fact that might shock you a little bit. The last native Egyptian to rule Egypt was a pharaoh that rebelled against Persia. I think it was I forget his name. It's top of my head, but he was a rebel pharaoh, and yeah. Like, and once how the Persians reconquered Egypt, it wasn't until Abdel Nasser, probably 2,000 years later, that a native Egyptian took power in Egypt and ruled it based on its own Egyptian state. Say, what are we talking about? Yeah, here it is. The first was Persia, and then it was the Greeks, Romans, Arabs, a bunch of Arab states, and then Britain. So for the longest time, until maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago, Egypt has been part of other nations, a part of other cultures. It has never been an Egyptian power because of Egypt. It's been part of the Arabs. It's been part of the Romans, the Greeks. So Egypt really hasn't been relevant in 2,000 years as a superpower. They're D tier. They're culturally cool, but they're just not relevant. I'm sorry. Akkadians for the same reason. I love the Akkadians, but they haven't been relevant. I'm sorry. They're D tier. I don't know why they're on the list. I don't know why they're on this list. Man, I'm tongue-tied. They're D tier. Shang, same thing. Cool in the sense that they were sort of the foundation of the Chinese cultural identity, but they haven't been relevant. China itself has. Certainly, but the Shang not. Last but not least, the Great Yuan also get D tier. They were short-lived. They only lasted about 90 years, and most of those 90 years were painful, full of suffering, famines, floods. They ended ignominiously, getting punted back into the steppe. It's cool with Marco Polo, but for the rest of it, just kind of punted back. Alright, so here's my tier list. So we have a bunch of S tier empires here, Rome being the top of them, then Britain, Mongols, and then the Caliphates. Go down France, Japan, Persia, Greece, then go down the list. I think it's a very balanced list here. We have a lot of really strong empires that influence the world and have direct legacies to this day. Some that influence the world but aren't really so prevalent. And some that really kind of were middle tier and then kind of lower tier here. Yeah. So it's my tier list. Please sound off in the comments if you agree with me or if you think I'm a moron. I accept all criticism. And yeah, please have a great rest of your day, and talk to you guys later.